California. He received a preemptive pardon from President Biden today. He also attended today's inauguration. There is so much I want to get to with you, Senator Schiff. I just have to start. I mean, in the last hour, Donald Trump was in the Oval Office, which I see as a choice, and just pardoned 1,500 people convicted for the attack on our Capitol. You did so much important work on the January 6th committee. You have never held back in talking about the impact of this on our country. What is going through your head right now?
It's obscene. It's a grotesque display of his new power as president to pardon these 1,500 or 1,600 people, which I have to imagine includes people that committed violent assaults on law enforcement. It certainly includes, apparently, one of the leaders of the Proud Boys. Rather fitting, sadly, that among his very first acts in office is to give a pardon to a white nationalist leader like that. So hard to imagine that we were sitting in the Capitol, the site of that attack, and hours later, the man who incited that attack pardons the people who participated in that attack. It really is a terrible way to begin, but not a surprising way to begin the new administration.
I think it's so important, and I suspect you'd agree with me, that we not get numb to this as a number. It is a big number, but there are so many people here in this group who committed acts of violence, committed crimes against our country. You investigated this attack as closely as anyone. What kinds of crimes, just remind us, are people essentially getting off the hook for?
Well, they beat police officers with poles, they beat them with metal barricades, they bear sprayed them, they gouged them, they crushed one of them in a revolving door. It was a violent assault. They desecrated the Capitol. They were trying to find Mike Pence to hang him. They were ranking Nancy Pelosi's office, looking to do harm to her as well, while her staff were hiding in a conference room, listening to the sounds of those attackers inside the building. It was chaos. But for these brave Capitol Police officers, there would have been, I think, much greater loss of life as it was. Many people died. And to, on a blanket basis, give a pardon like that, to call them political prisoners, is just abhorrent. It also brings to mind Pam Bodney's testimony, frankly, where I pressed her on the prospect of these pardons, and she was quite adamant about how she was going to go one by one through all of the pardon requests and make a factual basis to the president. Well, we saw how long that commitment lasted.
What does that tell you about her ability to do her job independently?
Well, either she advised the president not to do this, which I sincerely doubt, or she has no influence over the president, because it was clear that he was not going over these one by one to make a mass grant of a pardon like this. It was his, way of trying to once again rewrite history. But history will not be rewritten, notwithstanding these pardons, notwithstanding all the big lies he continues to propagate. And he was in the Capitol again propagating lies about Nancy Pelosi. We're going to continue to push back against those falsehoods. But this is part of that effort that he is making to absolve himself of the responsibility for the first, since the Civil War, the first effort to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power.
The lawyer for former Proud Boys chairman Enrico Tarrio, who we've heard a lot about, we've talked a lot about, told NBC News his client is already being processed for release from federal prison because of clemency for Trump. He was sentenced in 2023 after being convicted of seditious conspiracy in one of the highest profile January 6 prosecutions you know well. You spent a lot of time investigating him. I mean, we just heard from his mother. We haven't confirmed it independently, but talk about him a little bit. What is your reaction to the prospect of Tarrio being released?
Well, he was one of the leadership of one of these white nationalist groups that participated, that came to January 6th well-equipped with the vests and the plastic handcuffs and other things that they used or intended to use on that day. And to pardon him, I think, is very symbolic of where the president is coming from. It, to me, harkens back to his statement vis-a-vis the Proud Boys years earlier where he said, stand back and stand by or something along those lines. Well, apparently he had their back after all, as we see in this most offensive of pardons.
He also commuted the sentence of Stuart Rhodes, who was sentenced, just to remind everyone, to 18 years for seditious conspiracy. I'm asking you this because I want to remind people of who these people are, who they are very well. Talk about Stuart Rhodes' role in what happened on January 6th and what you may think it means that he was on the list.
Well, these are, two of what I would consider ringleaders of this. Seditious conspiracy is one of the most serious charges that the prosecutors would bring. It's not something that is easily proven. It's not something that is frequently charged. It's very seldom been charged in our history. So these were people that the Justice Department considered most complicit in the violence of that day, in the planning of it, in the conspiring to make it happen. January 6th didn't come by all by itself. It wasn't spontaneous. A lot of it was planned. So these are some of the ringleaders that are now being given this pardon in the president's first day. And if this is just the first day of this second term, imagine what there is to come.
It's an important warning. It seems like this didn't all happen in one day, but I started out the show by talking about all of the things that happened today, and one of them was the issuing by President Biden of preemptive pardons for people who worked on the January 6th committee, where some of those who were included, including you, were one of them. You called this decision unwise because of the precedent you said it sets, but you also said you understood why he did it. Which I think is a balance of how a lot of people may be thinking about it. But as you weigh all the factors, would you have preferred he didn't issue those pardons, or how do you feel about it?
I would have preferred that he didn't, not to the committee, not to members of his family. The reason why I understand why he did what he did is, the cause of all of this is Donald Trump pledging to go after his enemies, his picking an attorney general nominee who is committed to prosecuting the prosecutors. So these are folks that have pledged retaliation against those who held him accountable. So that never should have been done by President Trump. That's quite obvious. So this is a reaction to that. But nevertheless, I'm concerned about the precedent that it sets. And we see, of course, with Trump, he doesn't really need a precedent to essentially abuse the powers of his office. Regardless, I think, of what President Biden did, he was going to go forward with the pardoning of these January 6th attackers and insurrectionists. What does concern me, too, though, about the pardon of President Biden's own family members is we can now fully expect President Trump will pardon his kids or any of his family on his way out the door, which basically tells his family members it's carte blanche for you for the next 4 years because you're going to get get out of jail free card when you get out. And that is not the precedent I would have had President Biden set. Now, Trump might have done it anyway. He probably would have done it anyway. But nevertheless, that's my concern about these kind of precedent.
The precedent, he could take advantage of the precedent. Sounds like it's part of your important point. I mentioned you attended the speech today, and I think this is interesting to me because Trump has attacked you perhaps more than most people. I think we're all struggling with this question of how to return to norms and lift up democratic institutions while not normalizing. Why did you think it was important to go?
I've always viewed the inauguration as about the office, not about the person who's being sworn in. So whether I voted for the person or I didn't vote, whether I think highly of them or I don't, I thought it was important for me to be there. Now, I understand others feel differently, and I appreciate that. I respect that. But from my point of view, it's important for me to be there, as difficult as it is, frankly, to be back in that space, in that Capitol. And I think even more than on January 6th of this year, today I was even more conscious of the violence that took place in that building. Maybe because he was also there, and maybe because I knew that there was a prospect that he would pardon the people responsible for that attack. But it was surreal to sit there, to listen to the man who incited that attack, and to imagine that he was now taking the oath of office again, and how he might use the powers of that office.
So much revolving around that building and the importance of that building and what it represents. A lot of it